Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And we're going to talk about the squash box and organic control. So I'm very excited for the organic control part. As usual, if you have any requests for accommodations or any source of feedback regarding any accommodation that you might need, please follow this link or the QR code. We are an equal opportunity provider. These are some of our details, and I share them every week. So you probably know by now that this webinar is being recorded, and we will post it on the Plant Talk, excuse me, .org webinars. You can see past webinars as well as register for the upcoming ones. Today we will use the Q&A feature. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to pop them up there, and we'll do our best to answer them. This is our link for register for the upcoming webinars, and we only have one more left after this one. So it has been a great adventure to go and learn about specific pests and diseases in Colorado on this spring. So thank you for joining us. If you have come in every Friday or if this is your first time as well, thank you. We're glad that you are here. We're going to go ahead and start. And as I mentioned before, we're going to talk about squash bugs and their organic control. And we have Cassie and myself that we will help answer questions. Cassie is in Adams County. She's a horticulture faculty there, and I'm a Master Gardener Education Specialist. Our star today is Dr. Bragg Tonnessen, and he's a research scientist with the Western Colorado Research Center at Rogers Mesa, and he got his PhD actually in plant pathology, even though he will talk to you about squash bugs today. He knows now about plant pathology and entomology, but he got it at Colorado State University, something that you probably don't need to know. But Brad and I had the same supervisor different times. So it's kind of fun that we were trained similarly, but at different times at CSU. So thank you, Brad, for joining us and talking to us about squash bugs.
Well, thanks, Mary, and welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm just going to share my screen and we'll get started. All right, does everyone see the full screen of this?
Yes, we can
Good,
see it.
great. Right. Um, okay, so first off, yeah, I'm going to go over some biology of the squash bug and also organic control, of course. And we'll even get into some studies that we're going to be doing here at our research center. So I'm from the Western Colorado Research Center, Rogers Mesa. That's in Hotchkiss, Colorado, so on the western slope. We're in a unique area where there's the highest amount of organic farms in our area, and it's growing as well. So our research center is 100% certified organic, and we work within that system. So when we talk about ways of control, we stay within those bounds as well. So I'll be getting into organic control specifically. If you have any questions on conventional stuff, I might not have the answer, but maybe the three of us might be able to come together for that. But yeah, let's just get started. Here we go. Okay. So the squash bug, um, Anastratristis is its species name, and it is a true bug. All right, so when you call it a bug, an insect is a bug if it has piercing and sucking mouth parts, so a proboscis and a stylet. Um, so that's what the squash bug is. It's also under the category of leaf-footed bugs, a choriid, and I'm sure all the people on this call are familiar with it because you're looking for control, but it's a small 5/8 inch long, gray to brownish black. It has these characteristic orange or brownish stripes along the edges of it, and it has this flat back. It has wings. Yes, it can fly, if you didn't know. And indeed, yes, the picture there on the right, they definitely are sucking this plant quite a bit. Um, I went through some of old publications on the squash bug. It's been around for a very long time, ever since squash has existed, really, and it's native to the Americas. So we've had squash bug ever since we've been cultivating squash. But there's some funny anecdotes here on the actual stink of it, right? Because it is in the stink bug category. And this odor, this is from 1940, and this odor is one of the best known characteristics of the squash bug and has been described as that of ripe pears. I don't know if anyone else agrees with that one. Uh, but in extreme dilution, it's not unpleasant, but in concentration, it is quite nauseating. I liked that. And there was also some talk about a study that some scientists did way back when, where if a squash bug nymph was dropped into a wide mouth bottle containing a toad, the repugnatorial secretion exerted an anesthetic action by throwing the toad into a temporary stupor, whatever that looks like. And but also, if sufficient bugs were introduced, the toad succumbed. And so enough squash bug nymphs, so that's the young ones, into a into a bottle with a toad seems to kill it. So that's how rough that stink can be. Um, and so a little bit more on the history is this is like I said, it's been around a long time, but officially it was named Anassa tristis by this well-to-do, wealthy Swedish aristocrat named Charles de Geer. So if you've ever looked up the squash bug online, you may see de Geer after the name of it. That's because it's attributed to this particular guy right here. So yes, a baron in Europe who ended up having an interest in insects. So he would receive collections from South America and and identify them and categorize them, and that was his essential hobby. And so that's where it was first named. It was back there in 1773, at least named in the European sense. Now, some more interesting papers I was looking at, because this has been a problem for so long, is in 1919, the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. So they seem to do a lot of work on the squash bug back then. And there's some interesting pictures here that you can see from this publication they made. You got your different stages of the nymph here in the bottom right, and in the center, they're a nice zoomed in version of the proboscis and stylet. Um, but they had some interesting methods of control, and actually they're not that outlandish even to today. And we'll get into that later. But the nymphs, especially the younger ones, may be killed by spraying with kerosene emulsion or with a nicotine solution, 2 teaspoons full in a gallon of water. And you can also add an inch cube of laundry soap dissolved into it. So some of this stuff might ring a bell, right? Laundry soap, there's insecticidal soaps out there. Nicotine solution, maybe we don't use as much, but it is a neurotoxin to insects, and that used to be used. And kerosene, well, so mineral oil is actually a little bit similar to that, but we'll get into it. So yeah, 1919, they were working on it and using those treatments. Another thing that a lot of people do today, it's been done back in 1919, is this is a picture of a field of squash with things you might have heard of them as hot caps, and they still sell them today, but it's just a dome that has a net on it. So it allows air to flow through, but it keeps the insects out. And they'll put those on the plants until they start flowering and then cover them. So it keeps the squash bug out for a certain amount of time, which is good. The seedlings are pretty susceptible to the bug. Um, but yeah, they've been doing this since 1919, and it's definitely a tried and true method, which I'll get into later for even organic control these days. Now here's another one, which was really interesting, was in 1938 in Fort Collins, Colorado. So the Colorado Experiment Station was working on squash bugs. And this particular researcher, John Horner, that's probably a picture of him out in the field back then. You can see there's a wilted squash plant in this picture he's checking out. That's one of the symptoms of the squash bug. We'll talk about it soon. And he was trying some different experiments on Hubbard squashes. And what they were trying out was a dry pyricide. So we'll get into that, but there are products similar to it these days. Um, it makes 1 part by weight to 5 parts of dusting gypsum. So we don't really do that much anymore, but you can see that picture there on the right of a farmer distributing dusted gypsum and pyrocide mixed together across the field. Now, probably not um, legal to do it without a mask these days, but they were saying that it can be 100% effective in terms of killing the bugs hit with the dust. Now, pyrocide is what they called it back then, and I'll get into details of what that is, but essentially that's a pyrethrin, right, these days. So you can see they did some studies here of dusted plots here on the left and untreated plots on the right. And on the left there, you can see it's pretty grainy, but you can see a pretty uniform field, right? And then the untreated plots that weren't dusted with this pyrocide and gypsum definitely have a lot of empty space. So they were saying it worked really well. You even have these yield differences of 12 tons per acre for a dusted one and hand picked. So they're actually going through and picking all of these squash plants, 8.7 tons per acre. And then if you didn't treat it, you're there at 4. So, wow, a 3 times increase in yield based on this dusting. So that probably seemed very promising in that day. They probably were using that for a while. And these are pretty large plots. You could see that scale of that person there in the picture. So hand picking those probably took a while. But really, this is just to give some context. This is not a recommended method these days. We usually use water to incorporate into our sprays and not dusting anymore. But just to understand that this has been a problem worked on for a very long time. Now, we're going to get into some biology first. I think it's good to get the context of how these insects act, how their life cycle works, um, to really get into how you should control them. Because in organics, it's a lot more about dealing with the ecology and the biology rather than just killing them outright by any means necessary. So we'll start with the adults. Overwintering. So that's the stage of the insect that overwinters is the adults, and they enter this hibernation or diapause is what they call it for these insects in debris and sheltered areas. So underneath any sort of organic matter you might have in the field or on the sides of houses or under plywood, things like that. So really they're going to find anywhere to overwinter. They can emerge from April to May around here, and that's when it gets a little warm enough for them to come out of the ground immediately. They're looking for squash plants, and they can find squash plants by both vision and olfaction or sense of smell. So how do we know this? Well, there's actually an experiment done where they would put adult squash bugs into a container with a plant nearby and some of their treatments where they would cut off the antenna of the squash bug and and then see if it would find the plant. So the antenna is their sense of smell. That's how they smell. Or they would actually paint their eyeballs so they couldn't see and see if they could find the plants. And then for some of the poor squash bugs, they did both of those treatments to them. And what they found is that if you did cut off the antennas or block the eyes, they had a lot more issues with finding the plants. Surprise, surprise, but now we know. um, and so females, they can lay a lot of eggs, 250 eggs in a year. And this egg laying happens throughout the year. Okay, so once they emerge, they're mating, they're laying eggs. It's not like maybe some other insects where it's a generation by generation thing. It's they're trying to lay eggs all year long. And if they develop to adulthood for the winter time, great. If they don't, oh well. But they're just reproducing constantly. Now, the time it takes for them to develop to that, um, from an egg to an adult, it can be about only one per year. So you can't have an egg in the spring hatching into an adult That adult lays an egg, and that egg then subsequently becomes an adult. That 2 generation length usually doesn't happen, but there are a lot of uh, happenings of adults maturing in those last parts of the year. Now down to the eggs. So, right, they've been laying eggs. They're these small oval shaped, about a 16th of an inch long. I'm sure you've seen those. And you're going to see them on the undersides of leaves and right where the veins are coming together is usually where they like to lay them. You're going to see them in other places because once they're prolific enough, they'll just lay eggs anywhere. But that's where they prefer. And the fresher eggs are more lighter in color, like a light brown, and then they darken over time. So if you're seeing a light brown set of eggs, you can presume that those were just laid, but those really dark ones are probably just about to hatch. Um, they're laid in clusters, about 20 of them per cluster. They're found at the base of these leaf veins, like seen here in the picture, and it takes about 10 days. So the range of egg hatching is 9 to 17. So if you're looking for eggs, like if you're going out there and scraping eggs off of leaves, if you have only few enough plants to be able to do that, um, going out once a week to do that can make sense for making sure you're getting um, each one of those hatches under control. So there's a little bit of organic control there, and I'll get into more, but if you do want to scrape off these eggs, doing it weekly is probably a just fine rate. And then the nymphs. So once they hatch, I really like this picture. It's the first instar, so the first stage. There's 5 stages of nymphs. And that first one is really interesting because right when they get out of the egg, so you can see how those eggs have a hole in them. They've just been opened up. You might be able to see that um, in your own squash plants. But right when they hatch, they have this beautiful red color on their heads and their appendages. But in just an hour or so, it darkens to black. So it's a very special moment if you can catch that, right? Um, but yes, 5 nymphal impsars, and it takes 36 to 60 days to reach adulthood. Each one of these stages is about 7 to 10 days long, can be shorter than that, but the range is so huge from 36 to 60 because those final instars, those final stages of the nymphs, which I have a picture here. So this is like the second, third stage, and then this is your final stage of nymph. And that final stage can take a long time for it to fully mature into an adult, and that's where that big range happens. Those earlier instars are every 7 to 10 days, they're changing, they're growing. But once they get here, it really depends on the type of plant they're feeding on, which I'll get into. Some of them are better for them than others, and it can take them a little longer to mature, depending on that. They almost say in the publications that it just depends on the insect, how quickly they mature. Kind of like us, right? And they're very gregarious and voracious. So they like to come together. It's the damaging stage, right? So that's when they all hatch, they're all feeding on the same leaf, and it can kill that leaf pretty quickly. So squash bug feeding, talked about all the different life stages. Um, they feed with this proboscis, like I said, so a sucking mouth part, piercing sucking mouth part, and it probes into the leaf looking for the vascular tissues. The vascular tissue is the xylem and the phloem. It's transporting water and nutrients up through the plant. And this picture here on the right, so the left side of the picture is the surface of a leaf. Okay, and then as you go further to the right, you're getting into the deeper cells. You got your parenchyma, collenchyma, so all those cells within the leaf for photosynthesis, things like that. But then you get into these big circles here on the right. And those are the xylem cells, and then you got your phloem surrounding it. So that's where all of the good nutrients are. That's what it's searching for. So it'll pierce through there, and once it finds it, and it can find it through taste, it secretes saliva, which breaks down the cells within there, and then it sucks it up. So that's what it's doing. It's piercing into the vascular tissue and destroying it. So that lower part of this picture where it's all black, that's it's saliva, stained saliva, showing how much it just destroys the cells there. And so that's what attributes to the wilt and the damage that you see is that because it's pretty much killing the vessels of this leaf. So damage and symptoms. I was touching on it a little, but in detail, first off with seedlings. So this is when I don't necessarily recommend that we direct seed unless you have a long enough growing season to seed pretty late, which we'll get into. But adults emerging in the spring, if they find seedlings and there's enough of the adults, they can kill the seedling outright because what they do with seedlings is they feed directly on the main stem because it's still soft and it's full of that vascular tissue and all that nutrient goodness. So they'll feed right on the main stem, which can kill the plant. Fruit, they will get to the point of feeding on fruit later in the stages, especially in a big infestation, and it can cause scars and sunken areas on the fruit. And mature plants, they're typically attacked on the leaves, smaller branches, because those eggs are laid on the leaves. The nymphs hatch and they essentially live on that leaf until they're fully developed. So they'll find leaves, group up, feed on it. So you'll see this burning effect because the nymphs are feeding. That's that picture here on the right is that darkening of the leaf, is the burning from all of those probing feeding events throughout those tiny little spots all over the leaf. Damages the vascular system. It can't flow its nutrients to the leaf anymore, so it just dies. So there can be whole plant symptoms, like a whole branch might start wilting because the stem succumbs and it can't send nutrients out to the rest of the stem um, along the branch. And then you'll see this wilt, and they call it a NASA wilt based on the species name, Anassa tristis, or sudden wilt. And a mature plant usually can work its way through squash bugs being present if there's not too many, but it can just die leaf by leaf because of all these hatchings occurring all over its leaves. And here's another picture here of some leaf burning occurring on a plant that's been inundated with squash bugs. So you can see that. The yellowing is just a precursor to the rest of it turning brown. All right, so conditions for infestation. Now that we know some more on the biology, uh, they're overwintering, right, as adults. So you'd think that a colder winter would take them out, but we never get cold enough winters for that. So yes, we have relatively warm winters for them, so we're never going to have some kind of winter kill of these bugs. So that's too bad. Um, and if you have high populations the previous year, think about it. The adults, if there's enough successful adults, they all overwinter. They're probably going to be in close proximity to where that squash planting was. So they're going to emerge and look for squash again. And if you're growing it again the next year, they're going to find it. Um, Undisturbed debris. So if you have a lot of that out in fields or just boards sitting around, I don't think there's a way to fully eradicate overwintering spots for a squash bug, but you can definitely try to minimize that. And early planting and direct seeding can cause problems too, because like I said, those seedlings are really susceptible to those adults that came out in the spring, and they can be attacked by squash bugs very quickly if you plant them too early. And we'll get into planting timing in a moment too. And of course, yeah, if you do nothing, it's just going to get bad. All right, so now onto the host. So squash bug does have a host preference, right? It goes for a lot of cucurbits, so that's the family that is its host, and they prefer different species of the cucurbit family. So the preferred ones, that means they have nutrients that are better for their growth and development. And I'll get into some results on that in a moment. But what's preferred here are the cucurbita maxima. So that's your pumpkin, your kabocha, your Hubbard squash, and the cucurbita pepo. So summer squash, zucchini, things like that. And there's also some pumpkins under that category, under that species of pepo. And then machata, so your butternut squash. So the three of those species, and whenever you're buying seed, you can figure out what species it is pretty easily. But those three are the most susceptible. But then you get into some other cucurbit species that are less preferred. So you have your cucumber, your sativus, uh, and your watermelon. So your melons are a little less preferred by the squash bug, cantaloupe, muskmelon, and then your citron there. So if the bug had a choice and those two plants were planted next to each other, it's probably going to go to the ones on the left. Now, there's studies done on this, but what will happen is the bugs actually probe the plant, so they might smell it and see it, like we figured out, but then probe it, so I taste it and decide to stay or move on. And the really interesting thing is that if they do stay and they lay eggs, the the bug that develops on that plant, so the females prefer to lay eggs on the cultivar upon which they were reared. So they prefer to do that. So it's really interesting info to know, right? Especially if you're trying to plant squash year after year, you might want to change up your variety or species as much as possible, because it might cause them to have a little less of a preference for what you're planting. Um, there's this here on the right is a study where they wanted to see how nymphs can survive to adulthood on different species and varieties of cucurbit. And you can see this percent survival to adulthood. So they put those hatchling nymphs onto these different plants, and then they measured how many of them actually survived. And the highest survival was on these pepos, so the pumpkin and squash, whereas you had a really low survival on watermelon, cucumber, and muskmelon. So there's something about the compounds in there, what nutrients are available. We're not sure if it's a toxicity scenario or if it's really just a lack of nutrients. But um, the other preferred varieties like the Maxima and Machata were not in this study, but you could assume they were up here in the percentages of 70 to 49, just like these pepos. Okay, so the next thing I want to get into is you might have some symptoms in your field that are indicative of squash bug, right? Like a wilting, like I said, or burning of the leaves. Those kind of things could make you think that squash bugs are the problem. You might see some squash bugs on your plant and then absolutely assume that's it. But if you don't have a huge infestation, there might actually be some other issues going on in your squash. And I want to point those out just so we can clarify when you're out there in your own gardens and farms to make sure that what's really the problem is the squash bug and not something else. So first off, I'm calling these all squash bug symptom mimics, but is bacterial wilt. So this is caused by Erwinia trachyophila, and it's vectored by the cucumber beetle. So the cucumber beetle is around here in Colorado. From what I understand, it's the spotted cucumber beetle that's most prominent. So that's the one in the top right corner here. So that green one with the spots. We also have a banded cucumber beetle that might be around, which is that yellow and green one on the left, and then a striped cucumber beetle, which is right underneath the spotted one. And then you have your larva here at the bottom, that bottom right picture. So the cucumber beetle, it feeds on the leaves, chews on them, eats them. The larvae feed on the roots. Problem is that this bacteria that causes the wilt is in the infected frass or the poop of the beetle. It drops, and if it's falling on leaves or other parts of the plant that are injured, like there's a wound in there, the bacteria can enter and it infects the vascular cells. And so as it colonizes in those vascular cells, especially in the main stem, you're going to see wilting. And it's definitely more dramatic during the day, as is with most plants and veggies. But you'll see leaf margin browning and yellowing as well, which is also something you might think is burning from squash bug feeding, but it might be this. And eventually the entire plant collapses and dies. So I have here some pictures of what that might look like. You have here on the left the wilting, all right? So you might see that. And the interesting thing is you can do some self-diagnosis with this. And that's, I guess we're calling it the sticky gook test. But if you have this wilting, you can assume that plant's not going to make it. So you can go ahead and do this. But you can cut the stem. So first you cut it, and then you put those two pieces back together and then pull it apart. And if this sticky, milky goo starts to, is keeping those stems connected, I don't know how else to say it, but if you see that in the picture, um, that means there's bacteria colonizing the vascular cells up and down that stem, because that's the bacterial biofilm and the actual bacteria themselves oozing out of the stem after you cut it. You can also dip this stem into water, and if you see a milky substance start to seep out in the water, then that's also another good indicator that this is the bacterial wilt. This kind of thing won't happen if it's just squash bugs causing your problem. All right, now here's another one. It's Fusarium crown rot. So this is a fungal disease in the soil, and it's caused by Fusarium solani, form of Specialis cucurbitae, and it's also called Fusarium root or fruit rot sometimes, but Fusarium crown rot. And the spores can survive for a very long time, so they're in the soil. They can infect the crown here. So the crown is the stem coming right out of the soil. And it's similar symptoms to squash bug feeding. It's yellowing, wilting of leaves. You might see some browning and rotting of the root in the lower part of the stem, so the crown. And that's this picture right here. So if you're seeing wilting, look at the crown as well. And if you're seeing this kind of rotting and even this white or pink mycelia that starts to develop there, that's the fruiting bodies of this fungus. So it's trying to reproduce, making spores. And so if you're seeing this, there's also like a water soaking look, like it starts to look kind of filled with water, translucent color. And all of this is indicative of Fusarium crown rot, which also can cause this wilting. So another mimic of squash bug damage. Here's a picture here on the right of a plant that's starting to wilt a little more. Even those ones in the background look a bit worse, but succumbing to Fusarium crown rot. There on the left are the spores. So if you do have a microscope handy, you can always take a little piece of that stem that was infected and mix it with some water, look at it in a microscope, and you'll see these little spores, which are indicative of Fusarium as well. And now this is another mimic, and this one, it's not here. I want to say yet, but who knows? But not a big problem for Coloradans, but it's a squash vine borer. Definitely look out for it, because we'd like to know if it starts showing up. But it's a moth that looks like this on the right, and it lays its eggs at the base of the plant, and the larvae feed within the stem, which causes wilting, of course, because you're breaking the stem down so it can't feed the rest of the plant or send water to the rest of the plant. And then you'll see, yeah, a section of the vine or the entire plant die, depending on where that larva is. So if you do your bacterial sticky goo test and you can't find fusarium and the sticky goo doesn't show up, um, well, you've already destroyed the plant, so we may as well cut the stem open a little more and see if you can find a larva. Um, yeah, I think those are all the different mimics. So I just wanted to educate y'all a little bit on being your own diagnostician out there to see maybe you might have some other issues. Now, if you do have things like bacterial wilt, then okay, time to address the cucumber beetle. If you have fusarium rot, then think about how much you're watering. You're probably overwatering your plants. And that kind of hot, wet atmosphere will cause the fungus to flourish. So maybe water a little less next time around. All right. So I have one more reason to despise the squash bug if you didn't need another, and that is the possibility of it vectoring its own disease. And that's cucurbit yellow vine disease, CYVD. It's so it's a bacteria, Serratia marcescens, and it likes to live in the phloem, so one of the vascular cells, and it colonizes that. So it doesn't colonize the phloem, so it doesn't cause much wilting. It actually just um, keeps nutrients from getting transported. So you won't see wilting, but you will see a lot of yellowing. I'll get into that in a second. But it's been found in other states, Texas, Oklahoma. So it's moving west. So who knows when it's going to show up here, but it might. And the adults can harbor the pathogen over winter. So it lives in their stomachs. And when they secrete their saliva whenever they're feeding, that's when the bacteria comes out and then infects the plant. So you might see the symptoms of foliar chlorosis, so also known as yellowing, um, and a honey brown discoloration of the phloem in the stem. So there's a picture there, cross section of the stem. The left side is a healthy one. The right side is infected with this disease, and you'll see this honey brown coloring of the ring around the outside, so the phloem, and that's a really good indicator. So here's a fun electron micrograph picture of these bacteria. And the first one, so A up here, so the top left corner picture is healthy. So these are vascular cells. What you're seeing is pretty much the cell walls of all the plant cells linked together. But the phloem are these smaller cells around, and then the larger one, the xylem, which is labeled as an X up here, that's the water transport area. But all these phloem cells, that's a healthy one, the top left. And then the right side one and the bottom two pictures are all different cucurbit types, so watermelon, cantaloupe, and squash infected with this yellow vine disease, this bacteria. And you can see they're colonizing the phloem, so all that plugged up stuff there. So they're plugging up the phloem. The xylem, though, is very clear. So water is still flowing, but the nutrients can't go anywhere. So that you're seeing here in those pictures. So that's why we don't see wilting, because the water flows freely, but the nutrients aren't flowing. And so the symptoms are yellowing. Here's another, so here on the right are some other weird symptoms with CYVD. So you'll get a yellowing, a stunting, but also here on the top right, the stem can actually be elongated relative to a healthy plant, which is interesting. And then you have a leaf cupping is another thing. So if the leaves are cupping upward, you also have a shortened petiole. So that's where the stunting comes from. The petiole is that stem that gets the leaf connected to the main stem. That's your petiole. It's a lot shorter in this disease. You also have roots that yellow there in the bottom left corner. So on the left there is a yellowed root, and on the right is a healthy one. And then you have that honey brown discoloration, like I said. So those could be some ways for you to figure out, especially if you have a big squash bug problem. Um, but you're also seeing some plants that are yellowing in this weird way. You might be getting both issues at the same time. So that's nice, isn't it? Anyway, so finally at methods of organic control. So I'll so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat based on all this. We'll get to them at the end. But I'm just going to move right into all these different methods. So first off, organic farms, they're great for squash bugs, aren't they? They so promoting healthy agroecosystems, right? It means reducing these broad spectrum sprays. You're trying to encourage beneficial insects. Um, you don't want to hurt pollinators. And so you're trying to find specific methods to deal with your pests. A lot of the insecticides used in organics are just contact insecticides. So adult bugs, they have a hard outer shell that keeps them from getting affected by a lot of insecticides. So a lot of these organic insecticides don't work well against adults, and we'll be getting into that. It's a common theme. Um, and there's a lot of mulch used and organic matter, minimum tillage scenarios. You're leaving around a lot of areas for them to overwinter, right? So those are some things with organic farms that can cause problems. But, it can also be bad for squash bugs because we can diversify our methods a little more because as organic growers, organic farmers, um, we know that we have to use integrated pest management, right? We have to try a lot of different things all at once to try to affect the ecology to take down this bug. So I'm going to get into 4 different methods and some examples that are out there. And the first one, chemical, then we're going to get into some mechanical methods, cultural methods like field management, and then finally some biological controls that might be available. So first, chemical control. I'm going to list through some active ingredients that are out there. I'm not going to get into specific products or how to spray or how much to spray or how often, because all of that has to do with the label of the product you buy. So you follow your label, then you're going to be fine. Just read that. It's also the law. So that's why I just say go to your label. But there are a lot of different products for each of these different active ingredients. So you kind of search for your product based on these. First one is spinosad. So this is from a fermentation of a soil bacterium, and it's it disrupts binding of acetylcholine receptors. So it's a nerve toxin, neurotoxin essentially, and the effectiveness can be on nymphs at early stages. Okay, so the nymphs have a lot more of susceptible skin, you could call it, but they are more susceptible to these contact insecticides like this, whereas the adults aren't. So nymphs at early stages can be affected by this. The next one is BT. So this is from bacterium of Bacillus thuringiensis, and it disrupts insect digestion. And so the reason why I put this one in here is because it's it's the purpose of it is to be sprayed on the surface of plants, and then when the bug eats it, it gets into their stomach and disrupts digestion and kills them. But squash bugs, so they're piercing, sucking insects. So with things like BT, that doesn't really get into the plant, it's not systemic. They pierce right in and they're feeding on within the leaf. So not very much of this BT toxin is going to get into them because they're not consuming the leaf on this, all the surface material. So I put it here that it's not effective because it requires ingestion and it's not going to take in a lot of that material. Azadirachtin, so this is the active ingredient in neem oil. and it's a growth regulator. It inhibits molting and growth. So nymphs at early stages are affected. The adults, not so much, pretty much always. And and it also may act as a repellent. The smell of neem oil can deter insects. Next one is pyrethrin. So we touched on that with that old 1939 paper, right? And that was pyrrhicide. So there's different types of these pyrethrins. They're all essentially coming from the chrysanthemum tenacitum flowers, and it's these insecticidal esters coming from that. Now there's different PYRE chemicals out there, and I'm going to try to describe them all here. So pyrethrum, so RUM, is the most basic, the most organic version of this. It's just the powdered flour, all right? And then pyrethrin, RIN, is a further so concentration of what's in pyrethrum, so an extract that is used in organics. So that's the organic version of it. That's more concentrated. So that's what's found in a lot of organic pyreth, etc. products, is pyrethrin. Back in 1939, what they were using was probably pyrethrum. So just the flowers in a dusted form. Now, the conventional versions of this are called pyrethroids. All right, so that's just a synthetic version of the active ingredient in pyrethrin, right? And permethrin is also a derivation that's synthetic, and that's more of like for human medicine use, but it's or houses, things like that. But that's where the distinction is. So pyrethrin is the organic one, pyrethroid is the non-organic one. And it's a neurotoxin, kills nymphs at early stages, right? Same thing. Um, Now, horticultural oil, stylet oil. So these are petroleum distillates. You can call it mineral oil, paraffinic oil. This also harkens back to what was the even earlier paper, but talking about a kerosene solution. So that's also petroleum distillate, right? Just not as refined as what we use nowadays, but they were doing something similar back then. And these oils block insect breathing holes. They interfere with membrane function, kills them. And say it with me, works at nymphs at early stages, not adults. But also this can work on eggs as well. So that's where it's a little more special there. Um, Insecticidal soap. So I'm sure you've used this for aphids if you're an organic grower, but potassium salts, fatty acids, it washes away the cuticle, so the protective coating of the insect, and breaks cell membranes. And yes, nymphs at early stages, not that effective against adults. Mhm. And on to some more chemicals. So diatomaceous earth. So this one was an interesting one because it is recommended in a lot of extension fact sheets, things like that. And it's derived from diatoms in the oceans. It's silica, amorphous silicon dioxide. You can essentially think of it as spreading broken glass around the floor for these insects. And it's spread around the base of the plant. So you might spread it around the base. So the behavior of these insects, which I didn't mention before, but at night they like to come down, right, from the plant. The plant isn't moving any nutrients or water at night because there's no sunlight to start pulling it. So they stop feeding and they find a place to rest and find shelter. And that's usually around the base of the plant. And so if you're spreading this diatomaceous earth around there, they will most likely come in contact with it during that nighttime. And it's abrasive. It also dries out the insects. So it can work on nymphs at early stages and possibly some adult damage because their hard exoskeleton might be damaged by this. Problem with diatomaceous earth is that if there's any wetting event, if you're watering or if it rains, it becomes ineffective when it's wet. The next one is kaolin clay. I put this in here because some people have mentioned it. I don't think there's much effectiveness and there's no evidence out there, but it's a powdered kaolinite, it's clay. And it's sprayed on the entire plant and it's more of a crop protectant. So it changes the coloration of a plant, which causes some insects to not recognize it as a host and it moves on before it even comes in contact. So there's no evidence that this actually works for squash bug. It works for other things. Um, but just put it here to say probably not the most tried and true method for anyone to do. Um, and then we have plant oils. So you have clove, spearmint, peppermint, lemongrass, rosemary, geranium, essential oils of the same kind. They can disrupt host recognition. Some of them contain insecticidal properties, and the nymphs at early stages can be affected by this or adult host finding. Might be a repellent aspect to these plant oils. All right, so those are all the sprays. Just one thing I wanted to note with spraying is that, as you know, the insects like to be on the underside of leaves, the base of the plant. So if you're ever spraying on the top of the plant is going to do absolutely nothing. You have to you have to get underneath the plant. So however you're spraying any of these chemicals or distributing them, get that sprayer underneath and facing upward. Get all underneath all of those leaves. It's the best way to do it. All right, so mechanical control, this is a little more for smaller scale growers, but there is so back from that 1938 paper again, this was really interesting, was just small wooden boxes about 3 inches square, 1.5 inches deep, and about 90% of the bugs were attracted to the boxes. So like I said before, their behavior is to come down at night and find shelter. And if you just put these boxes there, it's something they might prefer. You just put the open side down, maybe leave a little bit of a space for them to crawl into it. And you could just go through every morning, maybe with a bucket full of soapy water and just pick them up, dunk them into that, and then put them back out every day. And that could take care of a lot of the population, especially if you only have 20 plants or so. It's not a big deal to do that. Um, you can also do by hand, weekly egg scraping, like I said, because it takes about 10 days for the eggs to hatch. So if you're out there weekly trying to get rid of the eggs, you might make a really good dent on the population. Um, there's a duct tape method. This was mentioned from another person from a previous webinar of just duct tape on a couple of your fingers and just dab anywhere where you see them. And they're stuck on there and you can take care of them. Another way is removing old leaves. So mature squash bugs on larger plants, they like to lay their eggs on those large leaves. Um, so if you do remove those and encourages the squash to grow more, but it can get rid of those initial harboring spots for a lot of the eggs and the nymphs to develop. All right, and then so some cultural control. So first off, I want to talk about planting timing and then trap crops. So adults, they emerge in April, like I said. So planting later should dodge the initial colonization, right? Um, the idea is that you plant later than your neighbor, the squash bugs go over there, right? Um, and it makes sense too, because the nymphs don't travel, they can't fly yet. So they're essentially rearing themselves on that squash plant that they were laid on. And the adults will stick around a plant that is nice and healthy for them to rear offspring as well. So once they find a plant in the spring, it's going to take a while for some colonization event or migration event for them to find another one. Now, also just planting at different planting dates in the same area works, and that's the study here on the right. So in Oklahoma, this was way back in 1991. They direct seeded plants and different dates in May, so the 6th, 14th, 22nd, the 30th. And they were all in the same field, but randomized within that field. And what they found is that less adults were on the plants that were planted later. So they preferred the first available plant to start with, and they also preferred the larger plants. So This, which means that they prefer those ones that were planted first. And so if you plant later and there's some other plants that were planted earlier, they're probably going to end up on those earlier plants. Now, this is where the trap crop concept can come in, because if so the trap crop concept is typically you're planting something that's more desirable or susceptible to an insect. The insect will go to that one rather than the crop that you're trying to grow for your product that you're selling or eating. And once they are colonizing on that one they prefer, you destroy them, right? So you either spray the heck out of them or you just wreck it, you like burn it down, do whatever you want. But that's how a trap crop works. And you could try that with squash by just doing an earlier planting, and that's your trap crop. So maybe 2 to 3 weeks before planting your desired one, use a susceptible cultivar, right? The one that's more preferred, the Maxima, the Peppo, the Machada. And before you plant or maybe you wait a little bit longer after you transplant your desired crop, but once there's a good colonization there and the adults have found it and they started laying some eggs, destroy those bugs on that trap crop by any means necessary. Do whatever you want. But to do that is a trap crop method based on planting timing, which you could do. Another thing is just the question of mulch, right? So plastic mulch, what we call it. So that's just black plastic or other colored plastic, which you lay down to control weeds um, and retain moisture. But there's some studies done on different colors of this mulch, this plastic mulch, and there's really no difference for control of the squash bug. They tried white, they tried reflective, or black. Didn't try other colors, but those three had no difference in terms of squash bug pressure. Um, but the reflective mulch, which would be a headache to put out, but um, can control aphids, thrips, cucumber beetles, white flies, things like that, but seems to not have an effect on squash bug. But now, comparing that to, let's say, organic mulch like straw or just bare ground. And what they find is that plants are more infested in plastic mulch fields. And the reason, probably, most likely, and there's some evidence too, is that they have a place to find shelter at night. So they go right underneath that plastic at night and then come out of it in the daytime. So they can really conglomerate underneath that plastic and they have a place that shelters them, possibly even from any generalist predators that might go after them, things like that. Organic mulch, so straw mulch, has a little more of mixed results. It's not so consistently bad. Um, this might just be because there's more accessibility of other biology to be existing within the straw mulch. But anyway, it's a more mixed results. And so I don't think I would not recommend organic mulch. Bare ground generally has less squash bugs, and that's probably because of this, a lack of a place to have shelter. All right, so another method of mulch is a regenerative method I call strip tillage and roller crimping. So that's what that picture there is on the right. So strip tillage is essentially you're not tilling the whole field, you're just tilling 10, 12-inch wide strip to prep for your planting of veggies rather than tilling everything. Um, and roller crimping is this idea of growing a grass cover crop. So treated kale, rye, those are two really good ones. You sow that in the fall and you let it grow in the springtime until it starts to flower and then get to milking stage. So that's when the grain, if you push on the grain, it um, splurts out like a little like, milky substance. And yeah, it's just the starch. It's developing into the starch grain. Anyway, So once you get to that stage, it's fully maturing. The stalk um, of the grass is really firm, so you can roll it over with this implement here, this roller crimper, and break the stem and kill the plant. And what it does is it results in this mulch layer. And it's like a quote unquote living mulch, has just been killed, but it's um it's a mulch layer where then you're not disturbing the soil as much, and then you can strip till into that and plant your squash. And there's actually been a couple of studies looking at this method, and they found that fewer squash bugs and cucumber beetles compared to plastic mulch and bare ground. So this kind of strip tillage, conservation, and having some kind of like living soil around your planting is reducing the occurrence of this insect. Um, there is like comparatively less yield in these strip tilling scenarios, and I think that's more of just getting dialed in how you fertilize those plants because you're going to have to get your nutrition right there in the strip rather than broadcasting it. And I think in a lot of these studies, they just broadcasted it and then did their strip tilling. And all of that nutrition sitting on the top of the soil that wasn't incorporated is probably not going to feed the plants. All right. So um, those are some good methods you can try for sure. And exclusion and rotation, of course. So, like I said, those hot caps from way back in 1919. You put them on the plants. You could do row cover if you want, um, or insect netting, anything like that. And also, yeah, so any of these coverages could work, but you have to remove it once they start flowering. Okay, so they need insect pollination. Um, so it has to be uncovered for that to happen and for the fruit to develop. But if you do cover it for that long, it's almost like planting later, right? Because the squash bug can't find it until it's uncovered. So it can give the plant a head start, and those adults emerging in the spring probably won't find it before they find another squash plant. Um, rotation, if you think about the behavior, the adults aren't going to live an extra season if they can't find a single squash plant. So they're going to leave your land if you don't have squash there that year. So the rotation for squash bugs can't just be 1 year. It'll disrupt the cycle. Doesn't mean they're going to be gone, but they're probably going to be less prevalent right on your land. All right, so now quickly into some biological controls that are out there. None of these are commercially available, sorry, but they might be able to occur around here. And the first one is this parasitoid of squash bug eggs, Hedronotus pennsylvanicus. And there's a really cute picture, I'd say, of a small parasitoid emerging from an egg here. And so the adults are very small. It's like a millimeter long, and they it only takes 18-23 days from these eggs inside the eggs to go to adult. And they're attracted to these squash bug hormones, but they require floral resources. So if you're trying to promote these kind of beneficial parasitoids, uh, plant things with small flowers like buckwheat, mustard, stuff like that. Um, here's another one which is really interesting, Trichopoda pennibes, and that's a little more researched. As the adult is there in the top right, size of a common housefly, um, and it lays its eggs on the adult squash bug. So you see that picture there, those little white dots, white yellowish dots, are the eggs. And this is how it works. It hatches and the larva drills into the body cavity and attaches to a tracheal trunk. So it's like a breathing tube of the insect, so it can breathe itself, and slowly feeds and grows. And this picture on the left is what a full-size larva of this parasitoid looks like inside an adult. So pretty nasty. And it comes out of the abdomen, pupates in the soil, and develops into an adult. Now, this picture here on the right is they looked at all the different places. So they looked at 1,000 eggs on different adults and all the different places where they're laid. and it's mostly on the underside on the sides. So um, that's where they lay them. So if you're ever looking for these, if you're curious, try to find them there on the underside. Um, yeah, on the side, on the underside. So you need some beneficial plants to attract beneficial insects. So there's actually a study done on this, and this study was quite a lot. They threw the kitchen sink of flowers at this thing. They planted buckwheat, whitetail, cosmos, etc., as well as Johnny's beneficial attractant mix. So it was quite a lot of different flowers. What they did is they planted squash surrounded by these flowers or only squash itself. And they separated them by 150 feet to try to account for any um, movement to these insects that might be attracted to different plots. And the result was actually no discernible difference between plots in terms of yield or squash bug numbers. I don't think they looked at parasitoids, which was too bad, but they found a lot more natural enemies in squash plants and surrounded with flower plantings. So you're seeing more of an ecology there, and it could affect squash bug numbers. But in their trial, there wasn't much of a difference in terms of yield in the squash bugs that were present. Now, just to let you know, though, there are some generalist predators that take care of the squash bug. They like to just eat the nymphs or the eggs, like the ground beetle likes to eat the eggs of the squash bug. And then we have spiders and big-eyed bugs, rove beetles, even lady beetles. They can all be predators of the squash bug, mostly the nymphs and the eggs. Um, as I said, promoting beneficial insects, avoid broad spectrum insecticides, of course, because you'll kill them, and try these short corolla white flowers. So short corolla means little, just little flowers, small petals. Um, and you got to get those blooms going all season for them to stick around. All right, so I'm about done, but we're doing a trial here at the Western Colorado Research Center at Rogers Mesa. We're testing methods of control. We're talking to growers about things that they do, trying to collect data on different farms. And we're trying some different field treatments, like I talked about, bare soil till, black plastic mulch till, and then a roller crimped strip tilling. And so we're going to try all those methods together and see which one works best. We're expecting the black plastic mulch to be the worst, but that's what science is about, is you need your control of what you think is going to do poorly. We're also doing some different plant treatments, like row cover, putting it on until flowering. And we're also going to try, so I have some samples of this and I hope it like shows up and maybe you can see me here. But this is the apple netting, and that opening is about 6 millimeters by 1.5 millimeters, 2 millimeters. And we've found in some studies that there are some small wild pollinators that get through those nets. And apple growers use it to control the codling moth, which is the picture there on the right. But small pollinators can get in. We're not sure if it's going to be able to pollinate the squash plants, but we're going to try putting these nets on all season and seeing if they can get pollinated. And the opening of this net is it's too small for an adult squash bug to get in. So this might be a nice repurposing of this apple netting. Maybe as orchard growers move on to get new netting, and then they have some old stuff that veggie growers can try in this. And we're also trying uh, some plant oils, your neem product, and also an insecticide like a pyrethrin or a spinosad, and then also a control, which is just going to do horribly, I'm sure. So, uh, yeah, and we're going to look at some different data. We're going to count squash bugs, and we're going to put pitfall traps, which help us identify what beneficial insects are walking around. Um, we're going to try some bait and kill methods, different concoctions and plates, and checking soil temperature and moisture to normalize all that stuff, seeing how it's different across these different methods of field treatment. But yeah, I think I've been keeping you long enough, so this is it. See you on the other side, and this is everybody at Rogers Mesa Research Center. Um, and also, I'd like to thank our partners, Melissa Schreiner, our entomologist, Jeff Piper, and CSU Extension, and producer support that have supported this project here in our area. So with that, I think I'll stop and move on to questions.
Great. Thank you, Brad. And we are 40 minutes past the time, so I'm gonna keep it brief. But what happens if the squash bugs, if the people remove all the debris, will they have a chance to overwinter still, or where else will they find to overwinter?
They'll always find some place to overwinter. They might overwinter less on your farm or land, but anywhere on the side of buildings, any sort of leaf matter that's built up, um, they can also they can overwinter in places that are about up to 2 miles away. Like they can
Oh,
fly pretty
wow.
far. So so you might discourage them from being on your land, which might help the following year of them finding your squash plants, but it's gonna it's not really going to deter them from finding a spot.
Okay. So, yeah, I guess it's not that great, but
Right.
deterring is a good thing. Then the next question we have, Lisa is using a biodegradable paper on the beds to minimize weeds before planting the veggies. And she plans to leave them there, but will the squash bugs use that as a place to hide, or should you just remove them once the once the objective have been made, like reducing the weeds, or what do you recommend?
I would right. So I would recommend, I mean, controlling weeds is really important, and I wouldn't say go ahead and hand hoe everything. So I would say putting the paper on is great, but as those plants get larger and weed competition isn't as much of an issue, I would I would remove it. So those squash bugs, because the squash bugs are going to try to live on that plant all season long. So if you remove that paper once weeds aren't as much of a problem, you're probably going to help out the situation. Oh shoot, you're muted.
Oh, it muted myself. Sorry. Do we need to crush the eggs, or just scraping them off is enough?
You know, that's a good question that came up before. Um, so I talked with Mel about this, and we think that scraping the eggs is just good enough. Because those nymphs are very small and hardly mobile when they first hatch. So if you're scraping them off, you're damaging them to begin with, first of all. And them finding a host from being discarded on the soil is probably going to be a lot harder of a job for them. So, and also smashing them is a little difficult. They're pretty hard. Um, so you're going to be fine just scraping them off onto the ground.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'm glad that you asked Mel, because I also asked her and she said the same thing.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Good. And then last question we have, is rototilling helpful in the spring and fall?
Mm. Um, so yes, this is the same discussion for like grasshoppers because their eggs overwinter in the soil and tilling will disturb that. So whatever you're tilling is probably going to disturb and kill the adults that are there, but you're not tilling everything. So they're going to be emerging from other spots. Um, so I would say yes, it's effective, but I don't think it's a way of management that's going to really make an impact.
Yeah, sounds so it's effective, but maybe not sustainable long term,
Right. That's a good
kind
way to
of.
put it. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Brad, for this presentation. I definitely learned a lot about the organic control piece that I was like, oh, it's
Great.
effective, not effective. So thank you. Last thing I'm going to say, please submit the webinar survey, the feedback. We need to prove that these webinars have been useful so that we can get funding for next year to continue exploring integrated pest management in Colorado. So please submit them. I will greatly appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a good rest of your weekend. Bye.
Thanks.